Hello and welcome to a new episode of Agile TD Mondays. Today, Mark Winteringham will talk about some misunderstandings when it comes to automation or checking. But before Mark gets his chance to tell you more about TaTTa's and TuTTu's, I would like to remind you that the early bird tickets for the Agile Testing Days 2017 are on sale and you can save up to €275 on your registration. For more information, please go to agiletestingdays.com. And now to you, Mark.
Okay, welcome to my talk, Say TaTTa to your TuTTu, or anti-patterns in automation. This talk's come about some observations of working with various teams and my own sort of experiences of working with automation in the past. So my name's Mark Winteringham, and I've been working with test automation for almost 10 years now, helping teams sort out their tooling problems and also their strategy problems as well, and help them implement robust automation strategies. I'm a big advocate for automation in testing, and I also deliver training in API testing for testers, starting from complete beginners all the way up to advanced test automation for APIs. Blog about quite a lot of this at mwtestconsultancy.co.uk, and if you want to get in touch and have a conversation about anything automation or just anything in general really about testing, they can grab me on Twitter at 2BitTester or in LinkedIn. So yes, I want to talk about some common misunderstandings we make when it comes towards automation or checking, as it's sometimes known as. Some of these anti-patterns stem from shallow understanding about test design in general, and ultimately what I'm trying to sort of talk about today is about mental models and how we can use them to get the best out of our tooling and our strategies when it comes to automation. And these are all sort of drawn from mistakes I've made in the past as well, not just observations of other people who've fallen into these anti-patterns. So for the eagle-eyed viewers, some of you might have realised that TaTTa and TuTTu look a little bit odd. They're spelled a bit weird, and that's because they're mnemonics. And they are two mnemonics that I use to ask myself a question when it comes to test automation. But I want to first demonstrate why I feel that they're necessary. So say, for example, we have a check or an automated test, and it's working with a web page with a back end. It's navigating to a specific page. It's filling in the keys Mark and then Winteringham in the first name and last name, and then it's submitting something. And then once that form has been submitted, we're getting the title from the page and we're asserting the second page of the form has been loaded based on the title. Now this script is created and run across multiple browsers to check browser compatibility. There's a few different anti-patterns here that I think are worth exploring. So the first is checking that each browser renders the form correctly so it can be filled in by a human. The anti-pattern here comes from the assumption around the perception of rendering and WebDriver. WebDriver allows us to query a DOM that is being built in a browser. So this means we can check to see if the DOM contains the HTML we require to submit our form, but we can't check if the HTML is rendered in a way that a human could have trouble submitting the form, maybe due to CSS issues, accessibility issues, or sort of functional bugs maybe. This means that running the check across multiple browsers is redundant. It bears little influence on how the backend is serving the HTML, since all the browsers are capable of injecting HTML into a DOM. So if it couldn't, then no one would use that browser, because it's one of the fundamental aspects of a browser. Now, as a side note, WebDriver can inform us if an element can't be reached. Say, for example, if the HTML is missing, But if the HTML is missing, the issue lies with what is serving the HTML and not the browser, unless it's created by JavaScript, but we'll come back to that later. Therefore, it would be better to create an API level check with different user agents in our headers, if necessary, to determine if the correct HTML is returned by the backend, an approach which is cheaper and more stable. Next, there is the anti-pattern that we're saying, checking that each browser takes us to the same page after submission. So the anti-pattern here is the assumption that each browser might handle a redirect from a backend differently, which they generally don't. Again, no one would use them if they did, because this is following specific standards of the web. An API level check with different user agents, if necessary, to determine that the correct redirect path is returned would suffice. Again, cheaper and more stable than rather than running it through the user interface. Next, checking that each browser is using JavaScript correctly to create the form. So what if the form was created by JavaScript and not by the backend? There is a benefit to running the check across different browsers, since they all have different JavaScript engines that behave in different ways, and we want to ensure that our form creation works with all of them. However, the anti-pattern still appears in the submission of the form, and the assertion we're being directed to a new page, since this is all being handled by the backend. So we should consider breaking the check into two separate checks: a WebDriver based check for checking the JavaScript renders the HTML, and an API level check for checking that the backend returns as a redirect. And maybe even a third, just to make sure that the front end and the back end are connected and talking to one another. So we have these anti-patterns, and we have choices in terms of what tooling and what approach we take. And the way that I sort of aid myself in terms of choosing the right tools and choosing the right interface to work with is I use the mnemonic TuTTu. And TuTTu forms the question, am I testing the UI or testing through the UI? Because it helps me to trigger the question, what am I actually testing? What do I need to, what is it, the specific code that I'm sort of trying to work with to discover risk about? So I might change my WebDriver script to something in Postman. So for example, I might set a post request to my form endpoint, providing the same test data. And then what I'll do is I'll set some assertions within the tests tab within Postman. So I want to say that the response code is 302 and that there is a response header called location which provides me with the URL to the next page. I can run this once, confident that browsers will consume this and behave in the same way. I might decide to actually do this in a code way as well, if I'm still inclined to sort of write it using a programming language. So I could use a popular tool like Rest Assured, again setting the same test data within the parameters, posting to the same endpoint and asserting for the same status codes and looking for the same URL that's coming out that I want to redirect to. These are testing the same thing as what I was doing through the user interface. But what I've done is I've removed all that complexity of using the UI to create something that's much faster to run, much more stable and more robust. So what I want to do is I want to give you 5 situations in which we could ask the question testing the UI or testing through the UI. And I'll give sort of a little bit of a pause for you to make a decision yourselves before I give you my view. So our first one is, am I testing the UI or testing through the UI if I'm checking validation is triggered on the form before submission? So for me, I'm testing the UI because the validation is likely to be run by JavaScript, especially if it's before submission, because that implies that something is being done before it's actually being sent to a backend. Am I testing the UI or testing through the UI if I'm checking a record is created in the database on form submission? So for me, this is testing through the UI because the record is submitted to the database by a back-end service, or likely to be stored in a database from a back-end service. Am I testing the UI or testing through the UI when I'm checking an edit version of the form contains previous values? So for this, I'm testing through the UI, because the values are likely to sit in a database somewhere, and a back-end service is going to pull those values from the database and send them to the front end, maybe in the form of a raw JSON object for JavaScript to use later, or maybe it just sends all of the HTML for the browser just to render flatly. The key is that the values live within that JSON object, or will live within that HTML. So I can look for those values on an API HTTP level. Am I testing the UI or testing through the UI if I'm checking a pop-up appears when clicking a help icon next to a form field? So for me, I'm checking a pop-up which is a JavaScript-based entity or behavior, so it's likely I'm testing the UI. And finally, am I testing the UI or testing through the UI when I'm checking the form uploads an attached PDF correctly? So for me, it's testing through the UI. I'm sending a PDF to a backend for it to be stored somewhere. So there we have a few different sort of demonstrations in which we can use TuTTu to help us determine whether or not we want to build automated checks within the browser, or maybe we want to do it on the API level. And we could use tools like Postman or Rest Assured or any sort of HTTP request library. So that's looking at testing the UI or testing through the UI. What about going further? So this is where TaTTa comes in. So imagine that our form has slightly changed, and rather than a redirect, it just responds with a success message. So I've already determined that I'm testing through the UI. So I've created myself a Rest Assured script, and it's submitting a first name and last name again, and it's expecting a status code of 200 to come back. Now, the anti-pattern here is the assumption that that 200 is covering the full path. It's giving us information about the full path through a web service. Developers like to think, or they say, that a web API and a web service is the same thing. And I think from a technical perspective that's true. But I like to call them web services because I think an API is something distinctly different to the actual implementation within a web service for a tester, because we need to think about testing both of those aspects of a service. So an API declares intent programmatically. So you write something, you write a method, and that declares like how that method can be used and what information it requires. But then inside it is the actual implementation where the actual behavior is triggered. So for example, in this web service that's built using Express.js, which is a Node.js API service or tool, we can see that when we send an HTTP request, it's hitting lots of different things before it comes back with a response. We have the middleware, where it's parsing the HTTP request and breaking it out into usable objects. That is all third-party libraries. We have the root handler, which is where the API is actually declared. App.get is setting there is a GET request for this specific URI or URL. And depending on what we send on our HTTP request, that matches to that route, which then triggers the middleware, which is where the actual activities are carried out, where the behavior is carried out before it sends a response back. Because if we don't pay attention to what part of the web service we're actually testing, we can run into problems like this. So I worked once with an application where I was getting 200s back, but every 200 had a message saying an error has occurred. So the API is working, I can access it, I can get a response back, but something inside that API call, something inside the middleware where the behavior set was breaking. So this is where I can use TaTTa. Am I testing the API or testing through the API? What is it specifically about my back end that I'm actually testing? And what interfaces could I use? So for example, I could update my check so that not only does it assert that we get a status code of 200 to make sure that we're getting something from the API, but also I'm setting a body tag because I want to say, it shouldn't also have the words "an error occurred" in the request. I want to make sure that what's actually happening is correct. And I could do this in a Postman context as well. So we can see the post endpoint, or the sort of Postman request to make a post to the endpoint doesn't change. But I've changed my test slightly to look for a 200 and then check for a response body to make sure that it doesn't have any instances of the words "an error occurred." But if I'm actually testing through the API, then maybe I can move closer in terms of interfaces. Maybe I don't need to use the HTTP API, but I could actually look at using the API of that class that's creating my record. So I could build a unit check where I create a new data store, call the create new record method, and assert that I get a true result back. Again, this is more robust than using the API call and even faster to run. And I'm still getting the same information back. So again, I'd like to go through a few challenges and some examples, but this time we're going to look at using TaTTa. So am I testing the API or testing through the API when I'm checking a third-party web service can be accessed? So for me, I'm testing the API. It may be that my team is not responsible for that third-party web service and what's going on in it, but we are certainly reliant on it. So I would maybe think about building some API checks just to make sure that that web service is still up and running and what we expect to get out of it matches our expectations. So am I testing the API or testing through the API if I'm checking a web service evaluates data and returns a result? So for me, I am testing through the API because I'm actually looking at the behavior within the web service that is evaluating that data and changing it maybe and returning results. Am I testing the API or testing through the API if I'm checking a web service returns a record in the correct structure? This one's a little trickier because it depends what's actually converting the record into the correct structure. Sometimes it's done by those third-party plugins in the middleware. So the actual tool that you're using to build your service will do the work for you. So that might be testing the API. But then it might be a case of that we have to explicitly convert it from one structure to another structure within our code. So I might be testing through the API. So there is a demonstration that using TaTTa actually helps me generate questions that I might want to ask my team. Am I testing the API or testing through the API if I'm checking a web service handles overflow data, such as an integer? So for me, I'm testing through the API because those overflow data are going to be used by certain behavior within the service. So what happens if I try and make the database store an integer that's too large, or if there is some sort of comparison between two strings, what happens there? Finally, am I testing the API or testing through the API if I'm checking a redirect is returned after an unauthorized request is made? So for me, I'm testing the API because a lot of security-based tooling can be used as third-party plugins, which actually capture the request and analyze the request before it actually hits the sort of the code that we've written, the behavior. So I'm thinking of tools like Apache Interceptor here that will actually grab the request and do something with it before I even get to use it in any way. So what we've seen here is two different mnemonics. TuTTu and TaTTa to ask the questions, am I testing the UI or testing through the UI or testing the API or testing through the API? And they give me value in terms of generating questions that I need to ask maybe my team and my developers to find out more about the application, to make a determination about what tool or what interface I want to use to specifically test something. So all that's left for me to say is thank you, and please get in touch.
Don't forget to tune in next week when Janja Kanegita will tell you more about the influence of DevOps on testing.